They knew there was a cure, but they didn't give it to them.
They didn't give it to them, and they actually stopped the men from getting treatment elsewhere.
You're listening to the Untold American Podcast, hosted by Dean and Jess. It's your go-to show for uncovering the fascinating, bizarre, and untold stories of American history and news. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode of the stories you won't hear anywhere else.
Welcome back to Untold American. I'm Dean Harper.
I'm Jess Morgan.
And we're back with another American conspiracy theory that turned out to be true.
That's right.
This time we're diving into something really disturbing, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study.
Yeah, this one isn't just some fringe theory.
Right.
We're talking about a 40-year study.
Wow.
Run by the U.S. Public Health Service.
A government agency.
A government agency that for decades misled and withheld treatment from hundreds of black men.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that.
It's heavy stuff, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's important we unpack this.
Absolutely.
To really understand how this could even happen.
Yeah.
We got to go back to the early 20th century.
Okay, early 1900s.
Back then, syphilis was a major public health problem.
Right, especially in the South.
Especially in the South, you're right.
And the way people understood syphilis back then was,
Oh.
well, frankly, it was based on racist pseudoscience.
Absolutely.
I was reading some of these old medical journals, and doctors actually believed
It's wow.
black men had overdeveloped genitals and
Mm.
insatiable sexual appetites.
It's shocking, but sadly, that's what they thought. It's unbelievable.
I know, and those beliefs were used to justify this whole study.
So basically, they were saying black men were more prone to STIs because of their race?
Exactly.
Which is just completely bogus.
And they also believed that black people wouldn't seek treatment for syphilis anyway.
Wow.
That's how ingrained these racist ideas were.
It's just,
It's mind-blowing.
I know, and it really sets the stage for how this study could even happen.
Right. It's like the foundation for this whole messed up situation.
It's crucial context, you know, and it shows that this wasn't just some isolated, unethical study.
Right.
This was part of a system that devalued black lives.
A system that saw them as less than human.
Exactly.
So let's get into the specifics then.
Okay.
1932, the U.S. Public Health Service sets up this study in Macon County, Alabama.
Why there specifically? Well, Macon County had a mostly black population, and a lot of residents were poor sharecroppers.
Okay, so they were already vulnerable.
Exactly, and they recruited 600 black men.
Okay.
399 of them already had syphilis.
399 men who had no idea they had syphilis.
Right. They were promised free medical care.
Oh, wow.
For what they called bad blood.
Bad blood.
Which could mean anything, really.
So vague.
Totally, and they didn't get any real treatment.
Wait, so what were they given then?
Placebos, ineffective treatments.
Oh, my gosh.
And even painful spinal taps.
Hold on, spinal taps.
Yeah.
As treatment for bad blood.
Exactly. And, you know, spinal taps are a really invasive procedure.
They are.
And in this case, they served no medical purpose for those men.
So why do them?
The researchers needed them to track the disease.
So they were willing to put these men through painful, unnecessary procedures?
Yeah.
Just for their data.
Basically, it's just...
It's inhumane.
It is.
I can't believe this happened in America and for so long.
The deception went on for decades.
It's just unbelievable. And it gets worse.
Oh, yeah.
Penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in the 1940s.
Right.
Safe and effective treatment.
Mm-hmm.
So they finally started treating the men. Then April, right.
No.
They knew there was a cure, but they didn't give it to them.
They didn't give it to them, and they actually stopped the men from getting treatment elsewhere.
You're kidding.
Even during World War II, when some of these men were drafted.
Wow.
They pulled men out of the draft who were about to get penicillin from the military.
All to keep them in the study.
Yeah.
This is just monstrous. They prioritized their research over these men's lives.
It shows how dangerous scientific curiosity can be when you forget about ethics and basic human decency.
And this wasn't just a couple rogue doctors. Right?
No, this went on for 40 years.
40 years.
Under multiple public health service supervisors.
So it was systemic.
Completely. It wasn't until 1972 that a venereal disease investigator named Peter Buxton blew the whistle.
Oh, finally.
He leaked the story to the New York Times.
I bet that caused quite a stir.
Oh, it did. The public was outraged.
Yeah.
The NAACP filed a class action lawsuit, which led to a $10 million settlement and free medical care for the surviving participants and their families.
That's something. But it's certainly not justice.
No, it's not.
It's impossible to imagine what this did to these men and their families.
It was devastating by the time the study ended. Men had died from syphilis. Wives had been infected. Children had been born with congenital syphilis.
All because of this horrific study.
It's hard to grasp the scale of the damage.
So the study ended in 72, but what about today? How do we even begin to grapple with something like this in modern America?
Well, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study forced a reckoning in a way.
Okay.
It led to major changes in research ethics.
Like informed consent.
Exactly, which shockingly wasn't standard practice back then.
That's crazy to think about now.
I know right now researchers actually have to tell people what they're signing up for.
Makes sense.
And get their permission.
What other changes came about?
Institutional review boards were created.
What are those?
They're called IRBs for short.
Oh, okay.
They oversee any research that involves human subjects.
So they're like a safeguard.
Exactly. They make sure ethical guidelines are followed.
That's good. That came directly from the Tuskegee tragedy, right?
It did. Those are big steps forward, but there's still the issue of trust.
Especially in the Black community.
You're right. The Tuskegee study left a deep scar.
Yeah.
And it's totally understandable why a lot of Black Americans still don't trust the medical establishment.
Absolutely. Especially when you consider that healthcare disparities still exist today.
Oh, for sure.
Black Americans still face so many barriers to quality healthcare.
Higher rates of infant mortality, chronic diseases, lower life expectancy.
It's disheartening.
It is.
So while we may have made progress in research ethics, the shadow of Tuskegee is still very long.
Absolutely. It's not just about remembering something terrible from the past.
Right.
It's about acknowledging how those injustices continue to impact people today.
And working to create a more equitable healthcare system.
For everyone.
And that's what we'll continue to explore in the next part of our look into the Tuskegee Syphilis Study.
We'll look at the study's lasting impact on both the medical community and the Black community, and we'll dig deeper into its implications for healthcare today.
We'll also touch on some of the conspiracy theories that arose from this study.
Oh, yeah.
Which really highlight the deep mistrust and suspicion it generated.
Definitely.
Stick with us.
Welcome back to Untold American.
We're continuing our look into the Tuskegee Syphilis Study.
A case that really shows how racial bias and disregard for human life can just warp scientific research.
Last time we talked about how this study went on for 40 years.
4 decades.
And how researchers deliberately didn't treat these men.
Hundreds of Black men with syphilis.
Even after penicillin became the standard cure.
It's unbelievable.
We also talked about how the whole study was based on racist pseudoscience.
Absolutely.
And how those researchers just lied to the men.
Denied them informed consent.
Basic medical care.
It's a story that still shocks people.
Even decades later.
Yeah. And as we dig deeper into what happened after the study, we have to face some really uncomfortable truths.
About America's past?
About how racism has played out in medicine.
One of the things that gets me is that this study wasn't some deep, dark secret.
Right?
There are articles about it in medical journals.
Just years.
It's crazy to think that something so obviously unethical could be happening in plain sight.
For so long.
It really shows how deeply ingrained racism was.
Yeah, the lives and suffering of these Black men just didn't matter.
And the impact on those men and their families was just devastating.
Men died directly from syphilis.
From complications caused by it.
Their wives got infected.
Children were born with congenital syphilis.
All because they were denied treatment.
The effects of this study are still felt generations later.
It's impossible to measure the pain and suffering.
But it clearly went way beyond the physical harm.
Absolutely.
What happened in Tuskegee completely destroyed the trust.
Between the Black community and the medical establishment.
And that trust was already shaky.
Because of the history of medical racism and exploitation in this country.
Imagine being told you're getting free health care.
Yeah.
Only to find out years later.
That you were part of a cruel experiment.
That ruined your health.
Your future.
Maybe even took your life.
It makes sense why a lot of Black Americans still don't trust healthcare institutions.
Absolutely.
The Tuskegee study just confirmed their worst fears.
That they could be mistreated.
Or denied proper care because of their race.
And that mistrust has real consequences.
It can lead to people not getting medical help when they need it.
Not taking preventative measures.
And ultimately having worse health overall.
It's a vicious cycle.
Rooted in historical trauma.
That continues because of the inequalities in healthcare access and quality.
And those inequalities still exist today.
Black Americans are more likely to be uninsured.
Less likely to have access to specialists.
more likely to experience medical errors and misdiagnoses.
These aren't just statistics.
These are real people impacted by a system that's failing them.
The Tuskegee Syphilis Study is a stark reminder.
That we need more representation in medicine.
More advocacy.
We need more Black doctors.
Researchers.
People making healthcare policy.
People who understand the specific health challenges faced by the Black community.
And are committed to finding solutions.
It's about making sure everyone has access to good, culturally sensitive care.
No matter their race or income.
And rebuilding trust by owning up to past mistakes.
Being open about current practices.
And working together to create a healthcare system that's fair for everyone.
It's not enough to just condemn the Tuskegee Syphilis Study
as something terrible that happened a long time ago.
We have to deal with the fact that its effects are still being felt today.
And that means confronting the systemic racism that made it possible.
And working to dismantle it in all its forms.
Until we do, the ghost of Tuskegee will keep haunting us.
Now let's shift gears a bit and look at how the Tuskegee Syphilis Study impacted the medical community itself.
Okay.
How did this change the way research is done today?
Well, after all the public anger came out, there was a lot of soul-searching.
Yeah.
And a push for reform.
Within the scientific community.
The study was universally condemned.
As a violation of basic human rights.
A total betrayal of public trust.
The government and medical institutions had to admit how serious this was.
And make changes to ensure it never happened again.
So what specific changes came about because of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study?
One of the biggest was the development of the Belmont Report in 1979.
Okay.
This document outlined the ethical principles for research involving human subjects.
Things we just take for granted now.
Like informed consent.
Right, explaining the risks and benefits.
It's making sure participants are selected fairly.
Exactly. The Belmont Report basically laid the foundation for how we think about research ethics today.
It led to regulations that protect people from exploitation and harm.
So you could say the Tuskegee Syphilis Study forced a complete overhaul of research ethics.
Absolutely. It also led to the creation of institutional review boards.
Or IRBs.
These are committees that look at research proposals.
To make sure they meet ethical standards.
They're like watchdogs.
For protecting people involved in research.
They make sure researchers get informed consent, keep risks low, and try to get the most benefit for participants.
They also make researchers be transparent about their methods and findings.
And report any bad things that happen during a study?
These are all safeguards that were put in place to prevent another Tuskegee.
And we can't forget about the role whistleblowers played.
Like Peter Buxton.
He was brave enough to speak out against the study.
Despite pressure from his superiors.
He was a key part of bringing it to an end.
And starting those reforms.
It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to say something when we see something wrong.
Especially when it comes to protecting people who are vulnerable.
It also shows how important a free press is.
In holding institutions accountable.
Exposing wrongdoing.
So even though the Tuskegee Syphilis Study was a horrible part of American history, it did lead to some important positive changes.
In research ethics.
It made the medical community face its own biases.
And prioritize the well-being of people involved in research.
The legacy of Tuskegee is a complex one.
But it's a powerful reminder of how important ethical conduct, transparency, and accountability are.
In scientific research.
And it shows that we have to stay alert.
To make sure the lessons learned from this tragedy aren't forgotten.
Now, before we finish this part of our conversation,
okay,
I want to talk about Eunice Rivers.
The Black nurse who was deeply involved in the study.
Her role in the study is a really complex and controversial part of this whole story.
On one hand, she was a big part of building trust with the men.
And getting them to participate.
She was someone they knew and respected.
But on the other hand, she was involved in the deception and withholding of treatment.
It's important to remember the historical context.
She was a Black woman working in the segregated South.
Which placed a lot of limitations on her.
It's likely she felt pressure from the white doctors in charge.
And we can't know for sure.
But it's possible she didn't have all the same information as the white researchers.
And maybe didn't fully understand the ethical problems.
It's easy to judge her actions now.
But it's crucial to consider how complicated her situation was.
Absolutely. Her story shows the tough choices people can face when they're part of a system that's inherently unfair.
It makes you think about the influence of power dynamics.
An unconscious bias.
In causing harm.
It's a reminder that we always need to be aware of the potential for exploitation.
Even in situations that seem harmless.
So even though we can't condone her involvement in the Tuskegee Syphilis Study,
right,
we can try to understand the difficult position she was in.
It's a nuanced part of the story.
That needs more exploration.
Indeed. Now, in our final part, we'll look at some of the wider societal effects of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study.
And think about what we can learn from this dark chapter in American history.
We'll talk about the importance of building trust
Addressing health disparities.
and making sure that ethical principles guide all scientific research with human subjects,
We'll also touch on some of the conspiracy theories that came out of the study.
which show the deep distrust and suspicion it created.
Stay with us as we finish our look into the Tuskegee Syphilis Study and its lasting impact.
Welcome back to Untold American History. We've been talking about the Tuskegee Syphilis Study.
A truly dark moment in American history.
It revealed what can happen when scientific ambition gets mixed up with racial bias.
And a complete disregard for human dignity.
It's a story that, unfortunately, isn't just confined to the past,
It still has a huge impact on how people view healthcare today.
especially in the Black community.
That mistrust is a real problem.
It can make people avoid getting the medical care they need
Hesitant to participate in research.
and ultimately lead to worse health outcomes.
We can't just brush this off as a past injustice. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study is a powerful reminder
Of the ongoing fight for health equity
and the need to fix these systemic issues.
that continue to put marginalized communities at a disadvantage. We've definitely made some progress since the study ended.
But there's still so much work to do.
Absolutely.
We have to break down the structural racism that creates barriers to healthcare access.
And quality.
We need to invest in communities that have been ignored and marginalized for far too long.
And it's crucial to acknowledge the very real trauma and fear.
That many Black Americans feel when dealing with the medical system.
That history can't be ignored.
You're exactly right. Building trust means being transparent
Being accountable.
and providing culturally competent care,
It's about making sure that quality healthcare is a fundamental right for everyone.
not just a privilege for some.
That's the legacy we should be working towards.
I couldn't agree more, and it's important to note that Tuskegee also gave rise to a lot of conspiracy theories.
Yeah, given what happened, it's not surprising.
People were understandably angry.
And looking for someone to blame.
Some people believe the government intentionally tried to wipe out Black people with this study.
It's a theory that makes sense given the history of racism and oppression in this country.
But it doesn't really line up with the facts.
Right, as horrible as it was.
The researchers' goal was to study how syphilis progressed without treatment.
Not to kill the men.
But these conspiracy theories, even if they aren't based on facts, show just how deep the sense of betrayal and fear was.
And they highlight how important it is for the government and healthcare institutions to be open and honest with people.
When people feel like information is being hidden from them,
It's natural for mistrust and suspicion to grow. And we have to remember that Tuskegee wasn't an isolated incident.
throughout American history, there have been other examples of unethical medical experiments.
On marginalized groups.
Unfortunately, you're right. We have to see this in the context of a broader pattern of medical abuse and exploitation.
Forced sterilizations of women of color, often without their consent, are another horrifying example.
And we can't forget about the cases of prisoners being subjected to medical experiments without their consent.
These cases, along with Tuskegee, show how certain groups have been historically devalued.
And seen as expendable in the name of science.
It's a reminder that we need to constantly be on guard against any research practices that could exploit or harm vulnerable populations.
We can't let ourselves become complacent
Ethical considerations should always be the top priority.
in any scientific research.
So Jess, as we wrap up our look into the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the men in this study weren't just numbers on a page.
They were human beings with lives, families, and dreams.
They were betrayed by the very people who were supposed to be caring for them.
It's a stark reminder of how unchecked power, arrogance, in the name of science and racism, can lead to terrible things.
We can never assume that ethical behavior is a given.
We always have to be vigilant in protecting the rights and well-being of everyone.
We also can't forget the importance of building trust between marginalized communities and healthcare institutions.
It's a trust that has to be earned through honesty, accountability, and a genuine commitment to providing fair and equal care.
It means understanding how past trauma continues to shape people's perception of healthcare.
And working tirelessly to create a system that is truly just and equitable for everyone.
Because in the end, the pursuit of scientific knowledge should never come at the cost of human dignity.
As always, I'm Dean Harper.
And I'm Jess Morgan. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Untold American.
This has been the Untold American Podcast with Dean and Jess. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed exploring these untold stories with us. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode with fellow history buffs and curious minds. Don't forget to leave a review. Your support helps us uncover even more fascinating stories. Until next time, stay curious and keep discovering America's untold tales.